Dialectics. If you've read any Marxist theory, you've probably heard this term before. It comes up frequently and appears to be central to Marx's method. Because Marx never laid out a comprehensive text on dialectics, there are many different approaches and interpretations of the Marxist dialectic. This installment in the Fundamentals of Marx series will provide a basic outline of the Marxist dialectic. It is entirely likely that more videos will follow in the future on this topic, since there is a lot to talk about and it is an important part of Marxist theory. But before all that, we should develop a proper foundation for understanding how dialectics work. In contrast to past philosophies, dialectics sees nature as a connected whole. Instead of treating phenomena as isolated parts, dialectics sees their interconnectedness. It then follows that to understand even one part, you must understand the whole and the way in which the various parts connect with each other. The dialectical perspective also rejects viewing nature as static. It instead contends that all things are in a constant state of motion, in a constant state of change. In other words, things are constantly changing and developing. Dialectics demand a study of how and why things change, and how that affects their nature, and the nature of related objects. Another fundamental concept in dialectics recognizes how quantitative changes result in qualitative changes. Instead of believing in a linear and progressive change in quantity of things, dialectics holds that change occurs quantitatively to a certain point, after which a qualitative change can occur. A common real-world example is the life cycle of a plant. During the stages where the plant is a seed, there is quantitative growth. The organism grows by the reproduction of cells, which is fairly constant. After a certain threshold is crossed, the organism is no longer just a seed, but a modest sprout. The change from seed to sprout is qualitative. It's not just about the number of cells in the organism, but about the very nature and function of the organism as a whole. The whole process of development in plants goes through such stages, in which incremental changes in quantity, in this case cells and chemicals, leads to inevitable changes in quality. It's fairly indisputable that seeds, saplings, and full-fledged trees represent three very qualitatively different entities and concepts. Another easy example is the change in states of matter of water. We can pour water into a pot and turn up the heat. At first, the temperature rises incrementally and the water remains as it first was, liquid. However, after we cross the boiling point, the water changes from its liquid state to a gaseous state. This abrupt qualitative change, evaporation, made possible by the quantitative changes, increase in temperature, is a central point in dialectics. An absolutely essential aspect of dialectics is contradiction. Contradictions are ubiquitous parts of all phenomena in the world. All things have within them internal characteristics that are mutually exclusive. Mao finds in math the example of differentials and integrals, in mechanics the example of action and reaction, in chemistry the example of combination and dissociation of atoms, and of course, in social sciences, the example of class struggle. The contradictions consist of mutually contradictory qualities. In other words, one cannot exist without the other. Furthermore, contradiction exists from beginning to end. It is not specific to a certain stage of development. These findings are what Mao called the universality of contradiction, or the observation that contradictions are present in all things. Despite this universality, there is also a particularity of contradiction. In essence, every contradiction has its own particularity. We should compare and contrast these particularities to develop a better understanding of specific contradictions, and thus the particular essence of a thing. Interestingly enough, from these assertions, Mao produced a guideline for creating new knowledge. The accumulation of knowledge of particular things leads to a knowledge of things in general, which we can then use to study new things by applying broad concepts to particular cases. In popular terms, Mao seems to be speaking of an inductive process that is followed by a deductive process, which can then allow for a new inductive process. Mao says we need to carefully study the nature and position of the two contradictory elements to better understand the totality of contradictions. The totality of contradictions being the web of objects and their internal contradictions that is interconnected on a macroscopic level. We should also avoid one-sidedness, or focusing on one of the two elements in a dialectical relationship, thus barring us from understanding the thing as a whole. Mao also talks about stages of development in contradictions and the importance of understanding these stages. Stages are characterized by changes in intensity of contradictions which are embedded in a larger contradiction. They can also be characterized by the formation of new contradictions. An important aspect of contradictions is their interconnectedness and the complex whole that they make up. Within this totality, there is a general principle of contradiction, or the contradiction that defines all other contradictions in some way. In the case of capitalism, it is the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. All the other contradictions are determined and influenced by the principal contradiction. These core contradictions are not immutable and often change based on shifting circumstances. The aspects within a contradiction do not exist on equal footing. Rather, there is normally one aspect that is dominant and another that is not. More importantly, the gravity of each aspect and their relation to each other is in constant flux. The principal aspect in a contradiction is the one that informs the contradiction on how it behaves for the most part. When aspects change, when the principal aspect changes, the nature of a thing changes as well. Aspects within a contradiction can switch roles, so to speak. An example of this is socialist revolution, in which the proletariat go from being ruled to becoming rulers, while the bourgeoisie undergo the opposite transformation. These switches are conditional and do not necessarily occur all the time. What is unconditional is the fact that there is a constant struggle between the two aspects within a contradiction. That struggle need not always be antagonistic, and each struggle often has its own specific qualities that need to be studied and connected to the broader picture. Lenin makes the statement that there is absolute in the relative. This is rather confusing at first. What he means by this is that the totality is within the specific and the specific is within the totality. To unpack this, we can understand it as a statement that recognizes that the whole is made up of many specifics. Likewise, each specific thing is a part of the whole. If we apply this to scientific theory, we should say that a general trend that is scientifically observable is made up of many individual instances. Together, the instances help us see the totality, in other words, the whole theory or law. By the same logic, each instance, each example, carries within it the general principle of the whole. In dialectics, the absolute that we see in the relative is the notion that all dialectical relationships have within them an internal contradiction. Contradiction is an absolute condition. It also follows that specific instances of dialectical relationships can help us produce a general contradiction or see a broad dialectical relationship. In this sense, the relative is in the absolute. If we go a layer deeper, the relationship Lenin identifies between the relative and the absolute follows the very tendency he is laying out. Both the relative and the absolute represent mutually exclusive and contradictory elements. Lenin talks of a unity of contradictions, which we see in the fact that the relative is present in the absolute, and the absolute is present in the relative. Moreover, neither would exist without the presence of the other. Without the concept of the absolute, the relative has no meaning, and vice versa. A final point on contradiction is that, given the right conditions, a dialectical relationship can transform into something qualitatively new. This happens when the internal contradiction reaches a boiling point. This does not mean that the object in question comes to some final stage of existence. On the contrary, this eruption produces a new dialectical relationship, with new aspects, and hence a new contradiction. As we talked about before, dialectics presupposes a constant state of motion, with periods of rapid qualitative change. Before we continue the discussion, I want to take a quick break from the video and convey my gratitude to the Patreon supporters who help make this project happen. The budget is very tight and your support goes a long way. Check out the link to the Patreon page if you feel like chipping in a few dollars. Anyways, let's get back to the video. When talking about dialectics, many people like to reference Hegel as intellectual inspiration for Marx. Marx did indeed take Hegel's dialectic and make it his own. Getting into the Hegelian dialectic is a bit too tedious, and we still have much to talk about in this video. Much of what we talked about in the Marxist dialectic does have a role in Hegel's dialectics. There are internal contradictions and the struggle between the two aspects which give birth to a new entity. The reason why Marx could not accept Hegel's dialectic was because it did not deal with the material. The subject of Hegel's dialectic was the idea. The dialectic was abstract thought moving through a particular process, where the resolution of contradictions produced new contradictions. This went on until human thought reached absolute knowledge. As a materialist, Marx was concerned primarily with concrete conditions that existed outside the human mind. This is why the Marxist dialectic takes for its subject the material, and not an abstract notion of thought. For some, Marx's extraction of the dialectical process from Hegel's work and its reinsertion into materialism is the essence of the change between Marx and Hegel. This change is sometimes referred to as Marx's inversion of Hegel. However, not all Marxists are content to leave the discussion between Hegel and Marx there. Althusser argued that Marx's dialectic was different from Hegel's at its very core, not just in content. Hegel's dialectic takes on a simple form, a single distilled contradiction that is self-transformative. Marx's dialectic includes overdetermination, the recognition of the existence of multiple, semi-autonomous contradictions that displace each other and condense at various times, producing change through interaction. Althusser introduced overdetermination to Marxism to demonstrate that phenomena are determined by multiple overlapping contradictions or causes, as opposed to one simple dialectical mechanism. Contradictions displace each other's positions within the complex whole, but they can also fuse together, which is what condensation is, to create a revolutionary mutation. The complexity Althusser describes in his concept of overdetermination suggests that there is indeed a clean break from Hegel in Marx's vision of the dialectic. In Hegelian dialectics, change is an internalized and self-generated process. In other words, Hegel's dialectic transforms itself. We sometimes refer to this process as the negation of the negation, where the contradiction is negated or undone through the fusion of the two contradictory parts. For Hegel, this mechanism is an inherent part of the dialectic. Althusser's interpretation of Marxist dialectics rejects that kind of simplicity. While there are still contradictions, they exist on many levels, and only produce change when they overlap in the right place and time, and only when the antagonism between the contradictions is so great that it results in an explosion. This video has gone on long enough. No doubt there will be more videos on dialectics in the future. The purpose of this video is to lay out the groundworks and introduce the major concepts so that we can go forward with a deeper understanding of the materialist dialectic. Don't forget to share your thoughts, questions, or responses in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it.